Hey guys! Tonight we begin with one of those quiet corners of royal history, the kind where the drama is technically over, but the aftermath lingers like the smell of last night's banquet. So dim the lights, grab a pillow, and let's wander into the lives of the women whose fortunes changed the moment their royal boyfriends stopped breathing. Because kings die, eventually. Crowns move on, heirs step in, the palace keeps humming along. But royal mistresses, they don't exactly have a throne to keep them comfortable. One day they're living in velvet. The next, they're wondering if the new king might hand them a pension or a swift eviction notice. It turns out what happened to these women after His Majesty exited the stage depended on everything: politics, family feuds, whether the next king liked them or hated them, and whether the queen had been quietly sharpening her claws for 20 years. Some, like Agnes Sorel, the first official royal mistress of France, lived in diamonds and influence, until illness or poison, hard to say which, took her out early, leaving her daughters politely ignored by the next regime. Queens, of course, waited patiently. While the king lived, they smiled across banquets at the royal mistress, but the moment he died, they finally got to redecorate the palace, starting with evicting her. And heirs weren't much kinder. Many had grown up watching dad's glamorous girlfriend humiliate mom, so when they inherited the throne, the mistresses often inherited nothing but awkward silences and unpaid bills. Some, like Nell Gwyn in England, managed to charm enough public sympathy to get pensions. Others, like Madame du Barry in France, ended up in convents, or, when revolutions rolled around, far worse places. A few clever ones married rich nobles or squirreled away fortunes. Others faded into obscurity with peeling wallpaper, too much sherry, and memories of better days. There was no single ending for royal mistresses. Some got titles, some got exile, some got nothing at all. Because in the end, their fate depended entirely on timing, luck, and whether the next people in charge felt merciful or vengeful when the crown slipped from one head to the next. And as we drift onward, the pattern only gets sadder, quieter, sometimes a little absurd, because once the glitter faded, most royal mistresses ended up playing a slow game of how fast can I disappear before someone takes my house, especially in places like Spain, where kings loved extravagance but heirs loved clean slates. So women like Barbara of Braganza's rivals, briefly adored in candlelit corridors, wound up traded off with a pension and a polite suggestion to take up embroidery somewhere far away. Meanwhile, in Austria's Habsburg courts, mistresses of emperors like Leopold I, already a man famous for looking like the genetic experiment of 10 cousins, often left court with nothing but some minor title and memories of men who spent more time composing sad little violin sonatas than running empires. Even in places like Denmark or Sweden, where royal affairs occasionally caused polite scandals in Lutheran tones, the minute the king stopped breathing, the women who once whispered in royal ears suddenly found themselves negotiating with chilly dowager queens, disapproving ministers, and heirs who treated them like political clutter to be swept away before coronation day. And you start to see the whole story as one long procession of women trading silk sheets for drafty country estates, clutching fading letters from kings who once swore eternal love, and then, inconveniently, went and died on them. Because in the end, royal mistresses lived on borrowed time, borrowed titles, borrowed favors. And once the throne changed hands, so did their luck, almost always for the worse.
And then there were the truly odd endings, the ones that read like history just got bored and decided to improvise. Because some royal mistresses, after kings died, slipped straight into nunneries, as though God himself had slammed the palace door behind them. Madame du Barry in France tried that for a bit after Louis XV's death, before the revolution came knocking, and, well, she ended up losing far more than her jewelry. In England, a few mistresses of Charles II married dull nobles with decent incomes and spent the rest of their lives writing long letters about their glory days, while others, like Hortense Mancini, ran off to become professional adventurers across Europe because apparently, once you've been a royal mistress, you either settle for a country manor or decide to start dueling people in Roman backstreets for fun. Over in Spain, some Bourbon mistresses were politely retired with convent pensions, which sounds peaceful until you realize half of them had to hand back the palaces first, while a handful of particularly bold ones in places like Italy managed to turn royal leftovers into political careers, trading gossip for influence in courts where nobody ever fully trusted them again. And scattered through the Habsburg lands were those quiet, pale women, sometimes cousins, sometimes widows, who had been mistresses to emperors with too many medals and not enough teeth, and who, after funerals, drifted off to obscure castles like pieces of unwanted furniture, leaving behind nothing but rumors, portraits nobody labeled, and children destined to be politely ignored by the dynasty that had once smiled at them across banquets, but now preferred they just vanish into history's background wallpaper. So as the centuries rolled on, the story hardly changed, and royal mistresses kept circling through the same quiet cycle, dazzling while the king lived, fading when he didn't, always somewhere between scandal and survival. Because for every Agnes Sorel who left behind poetry and diamonds, there were dozens of forgotten Annes, Catherines, and Marias who packed up their silks after the funeral, moved into damp country houses, and slowly became local legends muttering about princes at garden parties. Queens kept winning small, silent victories as they watched rivals shuffle off to convents or second marriages. Heirs kept drawing polite curtains over the messes their fathers left behind, and the mistresses themselves seemed to understand by the end that palaces were only ever on loan, the jewels just temporary, and kings had a habit of promising eternity with one hand while drafting their wills with the other, so that when the music finally stopped and the crown moved on, what remained were just echoes in old letters, fading portraits in attics, and a reminder that history's grandest affairs usually ended not with fireworks, but with estate auctions, pension negotiations, and the slow, inevitable closing of gates behind carriages heading quietly into exile. And yet, as we float further into the later centuries, a few royal mistresses did manage to outplay history itself, turning what should have been tragic endings into surprisingly comfortable retirements. Because some learned early that the only thing safer than a king's affection was cold, hard property deeds signed before his last breath. Women like Madame de Montespan in France, once the glittering star of Louis XIV's court, saw the writing on the wall long before her royal lover began slowing down. So when the scandals piled up and the king aged into piety, she quietly slid into respectability with estates, titles, and a future far cushier than the queen probably would have preferred. While others, like England's Barbara Villiers, simply married wealth after wealth until they died leaving children, debts, and gossip behind in equal measure. And somewhere in all this were the practical mistresses of smaller German courts, duchies barely big enough to hold a decent scandal, who ended up with minor castles, minor barons, and lives that looked suspiciously like early retirement plans rather than fallen woman tragedies, proving that if history teaches us anything about mistresses after kings died, it's that some went down in flames, some were politely forgotten, but a clever few slipped out the back door with the silver, the pensions, and occasionally even the last laugh before the palace gates closed for good.
By the 18th and 19th centuries, the whole mistress after king business became almost predictable, like an old play where everyone knew their lines. Mistresses of men like George IV in England or Louis XV's endless string of companions entered palaces with fanfare and pearls, and usually left with polite settlements, small titles, and occasionally a minor scandal trailing behind them like a stubborn valet. A few, like Madame de Staël in France, managed to transform former royal connections into full-blown intellectual salons, trading love letters for Enlightenment philosophy, and proving that sometimes, if you couldn't keep the king, you could at least keep the spotlight.
while others, in Prussia or Bavaria, drifted into country houses with piano lessons, parlor games, and portraits of themselves in slightly too much velvet, because by then the real drama had shifted to revolutions, parliaments, and the growing sense that kings themselves were starting to look like outdated furniture, and their mistresses, once symbols of power and scandal, slowly became relics of a world that was already packing its bags for history's attic. And as the centuries crept toward modernity, the fate of royal mistresses after kings died kept softening around the edges, losing some of its earlier sting, but also much of its old glamour. Because by the time the 19th century settled in with its railways and newspapers and brooding portraits of monarchs staring into the middle distance, kings themselves were less absolute, less terrifying, and frankly, less able to hand out duchies and diamonds like party favors, which meant their mistresses often ended up with generous pensions rather than banishment, comfortable villas instead of drafty exile towers, and the occasional discreet title granted by governments trying to avoid scandal more than queens seeking revenge. In France, Napoleon's various mistresses wrote memoirs that sold briskly to a gossip-hungry public who no longer needed court whispers when they could buy the whole story in bookstores. While in England, Edward VII's long string of companions, some actresses, some aristocrats, all faintly exhausted-looking in portraits, mostly retired into well-upholstered respectability, appearing in eyes dedicated to arranging flowers and writing polite thank-you notes. Meanwhile, over in Austria, the Habsburgs, still holding on to their dynastic habits like old coats gone shiny at the elbows, saw mistresses of emperors such as Franz Joseph vanish into country estates with names longer than the driveways leading up to them, occasionally hosting teas for distant cousins, while the empire itself began fraying around the edges like a tapestry with too many moths. And across Europe, in the smaller courts, Saxony, Hanover, places where the palaces looked faintly embarrassed to be called palaces at all, the same pattern repeated with less silk but equal inevitability. Royal mistresses appearing briefly in official letters or oil paintings before sliding off the page entirely once the king's funeral carriages had rolled away. By the Victorian era, morality itself had started staging a comeback tour, queens like Victoria making it very clear that the age of public royal mistresses was, at least in theory, over, even as rumors still clung faintly to certain royal households like perfume and heavy curtains, because history never quite gives up its habits all at once. And so the story drifts toward modern times with fewer jewels, fewer palaces, fewer whispered scandals, until what remains is mostly the echo of an older world where kings promised eternity to women who knew eternity lasted exactly as long as his heartbeat, and where the end of a reign meant the end of their influence, their luxuries, and sometimes even their names in the history books, leaving behind just enough faded portraits and awkward letters to remind us that for centuries, royal mistresses lived in a spotlight that always, inevitably, went out the moment the crown moved on to someone else's head.
By the time the 20th century finally ambled onto the stage, dragging along telephones, motor cars, and newspapers that printed royal gossip in fonts big enough for everyone to read at breakfast, the fate of royal mistresses after kings died had become almost routine, like the last act of a play everyone had seen before but kept watching out of habit, because by now monarchies themselves were shrinking, parliaments growing louder, revolutions tearing through maps, and the idea of kings with endless mistresses handing out castles like party favors was starting to feel faintly antique, like powdered wigs or dueling pistols. In Britain, Edward VII, cheerfully round, fond of food, racing, and women in about equal measure, had spent decades charming actresses and aristocrats while waiting for his famously long-lived mother, Queen Victoria, to stop reigning, and when he finally became king in 1901,
His official mistresses had already settled into lives of wealth and comfort, so when he died in 1910, there were no dramatic exiles, no queens throwing open palace windows to air out the perfume of scandal, just a polite rearranging of social calendars as women like Alice Keppel, Edward's longtime companion, slipped gracefully into well-upholstered drawing rooms and country estates, fading from royal gossip only because the new king, George V, preferred a quieter, more respectable image for a monarchy already wobbling under modern scrutiny. Across the Channel in France, well, what was left of France's monarchy after revolutions, restorations, and yet more revolutions, the mistresses of kings long dead had already been replaced in popular imagination by actresses, singers, and the occasional courtesan whose lives played out not in palaces, but in Parisian salons, buzzing with journalists and absinthe, because by the time cameras arrived, the old world of official royal mistresses was already crumbling like the plaster ceilings of abandoned chateaux. In Spain, Alfonso XIII collected mistresses and illegitimate children with a cheerfulness that suggested he hadn't read the political mood of the 20th century. And when the monarchy tottered into exile in 1931, some of those women found themselves stranded in a Europe where royal titles were starting to look less like shields and more like luggage tags from a vanished era. Meanwhile, in places like Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece, kingdoms invented in the 19th century to give restless princes something to do, the mistresses of various imported monarchs from German or Danish dynasties occasionally made headlines in gossip columns, but when kings abdicated, were assassinated, or fled revolutions, those women mostly vanished into villas on the French Riviera or apartments in Lausanne, living out quiet decades on dwindling fortunes while the world around them stopped caring. Even in countries where monarchies survived, Britain, Spain eventually, the Nordics, the age of the royal mistress as an open, glittering, half-political institution had ended, replaced by discreet companions, private scandals, and the kind of royal biographies that use words like confidant or close friend with a straight face while everyone reading them knows perfectly well what they mean. And so the long history of royal mistresses after kings died, once full of queens plotting revenge, heirs cutting off pensions, courtiers whispering over candlelight, and mistresses themselves hauling trunks of jewelry out of side doors before the funeral bells stopped ringing, dwindled into something smaller, quieter, occasionally still scandalous, but rarely historical, because the modern world simply moved too fast for the old patterns to play out. Newspapers turned secrets into headlines overnight. Politicians demanded respectability from monarchies clinging to relevance. And mistresses who once expected chateau now got at best a few awkward paragraphs in memoirs sold in hardback for a season before landing on clearance cables. The irony, of course, is that the early mistresses who had endured exiles, convents, poisonings, and heirs with grudges at least got drama, while their 20th century successors mostly got discretion, lawyers, and the slow fading of their names into genealogies no one bothered to memorize, because when kings themselves stopped ruling empires and started cutting ribbons at hospitals instead, their mistresses stopped being figures of political intrigue and became, at most, human interest stories tucked between articles about cabinet crises and horse races. And so, after centuries of queens waiting patiently for revenge, heirs slamming palace doors behind them, courtiers betting on who would get which estate, and mistresses themselves gaming the odds like seasoned card players at a table they knew was rigged, the whole tradition simply ebbed away, leaving behind a trail of portraits in museums, letters in archives, memoirs full of selective memories, and the occasional novel or costume drama pretending there was still something mysterious about women who had once lived at the glittering center of royal worlds, but died, more often than not, in comfortable obscurity, surrounded by grandchildren who grew up in a century where kings had less power than prime ministers and mistresses had less influence than newspaper editors.
And so we drift into the very last chapters of the story,
when the old world of kings, queens, and their carefully unofficial companions finally gave way to the modern age, the age of telegraphs, telephones, motor cars, parliaments shouting over each other in elected dignity, and monarchs whose crowns weighed less in gold than in ceremonial expectations, because by the mid-20th century the whole business of royal mistresses after kings died had shrunk down to almost nothing. A faint echo of centuries when women could rise from obscurity to palaces and fall back into obscurity the moment the funeral bells stopped. And if you look at the surviving European monarchies, Britain, Spain again eventually, the Nordics, the Dutch, a few scattered relics, you find that the kings of the 20th century lived in a world where discretion mattered far more than diamonds, where newspapers printed royal photographs by the ton and gossip traveled at the speed of telephones, which meant the last royal mistresses rarely had the flamboyant exits or tragic downfalls of their Renaissance or Baroque predecessors, because public relations departments had joined the story now, and scandal was something monarchies could no longer afford. In Britain, Edward VIII's abdication in 1936 over Wallis Simpson, not exactly a mistress, but close enough to the old pattern of a king risking everything for a woman the establishment didn't approve of, showed just how much the times had changed. Because instead of exile after a king's death, here was exile after a king gave up his throne entirely, living out decades in France, throwing parties no one in Britain officially acknowledged, while the monarchy itself tightened its image under George VI and then Elizabeth II into one of chilly domestic propriety, so that whatever private lives kings or princes might have had in the later 20th century, they remained firmly off-stage, tucked behind palace walls and legal discretion. Meanwhile in Spain, after the monarchy returned under Juan Carlos in the late 1970s, the old Bourbon habit of royal mistresses flickered back for a moment in rumors and tabloid whispers, but nothing like the days when queens plotted revenge and heirs canceled pensions because modern constitutional monarchs simply didn't have the power or wealth to hand out estates like playing cards anymore. And besides, the press would have had a field day if they tried. Across the Nordics, whose kings by the 20th century mostly cut ribbons, opened parliaments, and tried to look dignified on postage stamps, any companions outside marriage stayed firmly in the realm of memoir hints and discreet biographies published decades later for readers who preferred nostalgia to scandal. While over in the Netherlands or Belgium, the monarchies marched toward respectability so determinedly that royal mistresses disappeared not into exile or convents, but into the realm of historical trivia, because no one in the 1950s really wanted to think about kings with girlfriends when there were economic recoveries, Cold Wars, and decolonizations going on. And so the story of what happened to royal mistresses after kings died ended not with a bang or a guillotine or a queen triumphantly slamming the palace doors, but with the slow fade out of the entire role itself. As monarchies lost power, kings lost their medieval ability to shower women with titles and fortunes, and the public lost patience with scandals when parliaments, presidents, and movie stars offered far juicier gossip anyway. Yet the pattern lingered faintly, like perfume in old curtains, because even into the late 20th century there were the occasional biographies hinting at companions of Edward VIII in exile, friends of Juan Carlos in Spain, acquaintances of vaguely European princes whose names sounded like minor characters in Tolstoy novels. But by then the old script had collapsed completely. No more heirs cutting off pensions, no more queens waiting decades for revenge, no more mistresses trading court favor for political influence. Just private relationships handled privately, because the monarchy itself now survived only by being less interesting than politics, less dramatic than film stars, and far less open to scandal than it had ever been before.
And so, after nearly 1,000 years of royal mistresses rising and falling with the lives of kings, shaping politics, gossip, and fortunes across Europe, the whole tradition quietly folded itself up sometime in the 20th century, leaving behind castles turned into museums, portraits gathering dust in side galleries, letters locked in archives that smell of old paper and disapproval, and history books that now treat them as colorful side notes rather than central characters, because the modern world prefers its monarchs polite, symbolic, and slightly boring, which means the age of mistresses ending in exile, convents, or occasionally revolutions has passed so completely that today it feels like some strange dream Europe once had, back when kings still mattered, queens still plotted, and the women who shared royal beds could expect to share royal downfalls the moment the crowns moved on to new heads and the palace gates swung shut behind them for the very last time.
And so we come, at last, to the very end of the long, strange tale of what happened to royal mistresses when kings died, drifting softly through centuries of palace whispers, velvet corridors, angry queens, nervous heirs, and ladies-in-waiting who probably saw more drama than anyone ever asked them to, and it turns out the whole story is less about romance or scandal than about time itself, because the world that created royal mistresses in the first place was a world of absolute monarchy, where kings were not just men in crowns, but political suns around which entire universes revolved. And so, of course, the women in their lives, whether wives or lovers or both at once, ended up tangled in power, money, religion, and all the messy bits of dynastic ambition. Yet as monarchy itself withered into parliaments, constitutions, and ceremonial duties involving flower shows, the entire ecosystem of royal mistresses faded too, until by the late 20th century it felt almost absurd to imagine a mistress being sent into exile because a king had died, when now a king dying mostly meant dignified funerals, BBC documentaries, and stamp collectors sighing over commemorative editions. And looking back across the centuries, it's hard not to notice how wildly uneven the fates of these women were, because some left behind chateaux, titles, and entire bloodlines tucked quietly into the European aristocracy, while others ended up with nothing but debts, lawsuits, or, in the really unlucky cases, lifelong feuds with widowed queens who apparently had very long memories and very sharp lawyers. Yet for every Madame de Pompadour gliding through French Enlightenment salons in diamonds and witty repartee, there was someone like poor Barbara Villiers in England, who after Charles II's death found herself juggling angry courtiers, restless creditors, and the awkward problem of royal children the crown no longer wanted to acknowledge quite so enthusiastically, because mistresses often discovered that whatever warmth kings offered in life cooled very quickly in death, as heirs preferred quiet respectability to inherited scandals, and widowed queens preferred, well, probably silence, exile, or at least a nice convent far away. And maybe that's the real thread running through the whole story, how royal mistresses existed in this strange in-between space, never official enough to be safe, never unofficial enough to be ignored, living lives that could swing from diamonds to disgrace depending entirely on the mood of monarchs and the mortality rate of kings, until history itself finally retired the entire position somewhere between World War I, constitutional monarchy, and the modern habit of royal families marrying people with university degrees and respectable LinkedIn profiles. Because today, when kings die, the few that remain, the news focuses on state funerals, lines of mourners, maybe the occasional family feud about titles, but never on tearful mistresses being escorted out of palaces by discreet officials carrying settlement papers and monogrammed luggage, since monarchies now prefer their scandals buried deep in private archives, rather than splashed across Europe like they were in the 17th century. And so the story ends not with a single queen slamming shut a palace door, or a single mistress watching her fortunes vanish overnight, but with centuries of them slowly fading into portraits on museum walls, names in footnotes, or at best the occasional historical novel that pretends they lived by candlelight and poetry rather than political calculation and very careful expense accounts. Because royal mistresses, like the kings who made them famous, belonged to a world that no longer exists, a world of personal monarchies, private kingdoms, and very public power plays wrapped in lace, where the death of a king could change everything overnight for the women history remembered only as side characters, even though for a few centuries they played the game as sharply, cleverly, and sometimes disastrously as anyone wearing a crown. And now, with the palaces mostly museums, the monarchs mostly ceremonial, and the gossip mostly confined to tabloids about cousins of minor princes, we can finally let the story drift to a close, a long exhale after nearly 1,000 years of drama, irony, and human messiness dressed up in royal etiquette, leaving behind nothing but archives, anecdotes, and the faint sense that somewhere in the quiet halls of Versailles or Hampton Court or Vienna's endless Hofburg, a few ghosts in silk gowns are still waiting for kings who will never come back, still listening for footsteps that will never echo again, because history has moved on, the crowns have grown lighter, and the age of royal mistresses, for better or worse, has slipped forever into the calm, dusty twilight of the past.